The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty livestock auction yard outside Bozeman, Montana, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden fences. Grace Ramsey stood at the edge of the ring, her flannel shirt sleeves rolled up to her elbows, worn cowboy boots planted firmly in the dirt. The September air carried the mingled scents of hay, manure, and desperation, smells she'd known her entire life. "Grace, this is insane," her younger brother Mike muttered beside her, shifting his weight nervously. At 22, he still hadn't developed the patience required for ranch life. His eyes kept drifting toward his aging pickup truck in the parking lot, as if it represented an escape route from their mounting troubles. "We've got exactly $372 in the account. That's supposed to last us until spring. I know what we have, Mike." Grace's voice was steady, though her jaw tightened. She watched as a string of horses was led past, some sleek and well-fed, others showing signs of hard use. The auctioneer's rapid-fire patter echoed across the yard, numbers rising and falling like a strange mechanical heartbeat. Their father had died 8 months ago, leaving them the Sunrise Ranch, 200 acres of Montana grassland that had been in the Ramsey family for 3 generations. What he hadn't left them was money. The medical bills from his cancer treatment had drained everything. The bank was circling like vultures, and Mike had been vocal about selling out and moving to Denver or Seattle, anywhere with opportunities that didn't involve freezing winters and backbreaking labor. "We need a working horse," Grace continued, keeping her eyes on the auction ring. Thunder threw his shoe and came up lame. "We can't afford to be down a horse during calving season. We can't afford a horse, period," Mike shot back. "And even if we could, buying some worn-out nag at a kill sale isn't." Lot 47. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speakers. "Black gelding, approximately 15 years old. No papers. Sold as is for slaughter weight." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The horse that stumbled into the ring barely resembled the noble creatures she'd grown up around. Its coat was dull and matted, ribs clearly visible beneath taut skin. Its hooves were cracked and overgrown, and a network of old scars crisscrossed its shoulders and flanks. But it was the eyes that struck her, dark, intelligent eyes that held a flicker of something Grace recognized. Pride, defiance, the refusal to be broken, even in the face of defeat. "That's a meat horse," Mike said flatly. "Grace, don't even think about." $50, Grace called out, her voice cutting through the sparse crowd. The auctioneer paused, surprised. Kill buyers typically had the market cornered at these sales, and the bidding rarely started this high for a horse destined for rendering plants. A heavy-set man in a stained cap glared at Grace from across the ring. "60, he grunted. "75, Grace countered, her heart hammering. Mike grabbed her arm. "Grace, stop. That horse is half dead already." She shook him off gently, her eyes never leaving the animal. The horse had turned its head toward her voice, and for a moment, just a fleeting instant, something sparked in those dark eyes. Recognition? Impossible. And yet, 80, the kill buyer shouted, irritation creeping into his voice. Grace felt the weight of the worn wallet in her back pocket. Every dollar mattered. Every cent could mean the difference between keeping the ranch afloat or watching it slip through her fingers like sand. But something about this horse, something she couldn't explain, pulled at her core. $100, she said firmly. The auction yard fell silent. The kill buyer spat into the dirt, muttered something under his breath, and waved his hand dismissively. He wasn't going to pay above slaughter weight for a broken-down animal. "Sold." The auctioneer's gavel came down. Lot 47 to the lady in the flannel shirt. Mike released a long, frustrated breath. "Mom's going to kill us." Grace wasn't listening. She was already moving toward the holding pen, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The horse stood in the corner, head lowered, flanks heaving slightly. As Grace approached, it didn't shy away, another oddity. Auction horses were typically skittish, traumatized by transport and the chaos of the sale. "Easy," Grace murmured, extending her hand slowly. "Easy there." The horse lifted its head, and Grace got her first clear look at its face. Black as midnight, with a distinctive white blaze running down its nose. But it was the left ear that made her freeze. There, just behind the ear, partially hidden by a tangle of mane, was a small white marking shaped like a crescent moon. Grace's hand trembled as she brushed the matted hair aside. The marking was unmistakable. She'd spent countless hours as a teenager running her fingers over that exact spot, whispering secrets to the horse that had been her closest companion. Lightning, she breathed. The horse's ears pricked forward at the name. Its nostrils flared, taking in her scent, and then it did something that made Grace's eyes burn with unshed tears. It nickered, low and soft, the same greeting sound it had made every morning when she'd come to the barn as a girl. Grace! Mike had caught up to her, concern replacing his earlier irritation. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I have, she whispered. Mike, this is Lightning. Dad's Lightning. Her brother stared at her, then at the broken-down horse, then back at her. That's impossible. Dad sold Lightning 10 years ago. The buyer was from Wyoming, some breeding operation. They paid top dollar because of his bloodlines. American quarter horse, Grace said, her voice distant with memory. His sire was out of 3 Bars bloodline, one of the founding stallions. Lightning won 2 futurity races before Dad had to sell him. She ran her hand down the horse's neck, feeling each jutting vertebra. Dad cried the day the trailer came. I was 14, and I swore I'd never forgive him. Mike moved closer, examining the horse with new eyes. You're sure? After 10 years. Grace pointed to the crescent marking, then gently lifted the horse's lip to reveal a small tattoo on the gum line. A registration number that she'd memorized as a child. I'm sure. Jesus, Mike breathed. What happened to him? As if in answer, the horse shifted its weight, and Grace noticed the pattern of scars more clearly. Whip marks. Rope burns. Signs of brutal treatment that made her blood boil. Lightning had been a champion, bred from champions, worth thousands of dollars. To see him reduced to this, starved, beaten, destined for a slaughterhouse, filled her with a rage so intense she had to clench her fists to keep her hands from shaking. We need to get him home, she said. Grace, even if this is Dad's horse, we can't afford. We're taking him home, she interrupted, her voice brooking no argument. Help me load him. The drive back to Sunrise Ranch took 40 minutes on dusty county roads. Lightning stood quietly in the old stock trailer, his head lowered but his breathing steady. Grace kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half afraid he'd collapse before they made it home. The ranch house came into view, a weathered 2-story structure with a sagging porch and peeling white paint. The barn beside it was in better shape, thanks to Grace's maintenance efforts over the past months, but it still bore the marks of hard years. Beyond the buildings, the land stretched toward the mountains, golden grassland rolling like waves beneath the endless Montana sky. Their mother, Martha Ramsey, was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed. At 63, she still carried herself with the straight-backed dignity of a woman who'd spent her life as a rancher's wife. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her apron was dusted with flour. She'd been baking, as she did when she was worried. Please tell me you didn't spend our grocery money on a horse, she called as Grace climbed out of the truck. Mom, Grace started, but Martha's sharp eyes had already moved to the trailer. She descended the porch steps with surprising speed, peering through the slats. Her hand flew to her mouth. Lord have mercy. Is that? It's Lightning, Grace confirmed. I found him at the auction. He was being sold for slaughter. Martha's eyes filled with tears, something Grace had rarely seen. Her mother opened the trailer gate with practiced hands, speaking in low, soothing tones as she approached the horse. Lightning nickered again, and Martha made a sound between a laugh and a sob. Oh, you beautiful boy, she whispered, running her hands over his scarred coat. What did they do to you? Mike cleared his throat. We should probably get Doc Baker out here. He looks pretty rough. Grace nodded, already pulling out her phone. Samuel Baker had been their veterinarian for 20 years, and while they owed him money, he'd never refused to come when they needed him. The call was brief. Doc Baker promised to be there within the hour. They led Lightning to the barn, to the same stall he'd occupied as a young horse. Grace filled a bucket with clean water and watched as he drank deeply, then offered him a small portion of hay. Lightning ate slowly, carefully, as if he couldn't quite believe the food was his to keep. I don't understand, Martha said, leaning against the stall door. The people who bought him, they were supposed to be a reputable breeding operation. They knew his value. Your father made sure of that. Someone failed him, Grace said grimly. Or sold him. Or, the sound of tires on gravel interrupted her. But it wasn't Doc Baker's familiar white truck that pulled into the yard. Instead, a gleaming black Chevy Silverado, lifted and chrome-trimmed, came to a stop near the barn. Grace recognized it immediately, and her stomach tightened. Joe Miller climbed out, removing his Stetson as he approached. At 34, Joe ran the neighboring Three Rivers Ranch, 2,000 acres that his family had built into one of the most successful cattle operations in the county. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the weathered good looks of a man who spent his days outdoors. He'd been asking Grace to dinner for the past 6 months, and she'd been finding excuses for 5.5 of them. "Grace," he greeted, his voice warm but his expression troubled. "I heard you bought a horse at the auction today." "Word travels fast," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. Joe's eyes flicked to the barn, then back to her face. "Mind if I see it?" Something in his tone set off alarm bells. Grace exchanged glances with her mother, then led Joe to Lightning's stall. The horse had finished his hay and was standing quietly, his head resting near the water bucket. Joe studied the animal for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he turned to Grace with genuine regret in his eyes. "Grace, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." "What?" "That horse belongs to Harlan Graves." The name hit Grace like a physical blow. Harlan Graves owned the Crescent Moon Ranch, 15,000 acres of prime Montana land that he'd assembled through aggressive buyouts and questionable legal maneuvers. He was everything Grace despised, a corporate rancher who treated land and livestock as nothing more than profit margins. He wore expensive suits to town meetings and flew in by helicopter to survey his holdings. "That's impossible," Grace said. "This is Lightning. This is my father's horse." Joe's expression was pained. "I know you think so, but Graves reported a valuable stallion stolen from Crescent Moon 3 weeks ago. Black quarter horse, approximately 15 years old. He's got the sheriff looking into it." "Grace, he's already filed a claim." "This horse was at a public auction," Mike interjected. "Grace bought him legally." "Stolen property is stolen property," Joe said quietly. "Even at auction, if Graves can prove the horse is his." "He's not Graves' horse." Grace's voice rose. "He's ours. He was born on this ranch, raised here. Dad sold him 10 years ago. Yes, but he's ours." "Can you prove that?" Joe asked gently. The question hung in the air. Grace opened her mouth, then closed it again. The registration papers would be wherever Lightning had been for the past decade. Her father's old records might have some documentation, but they'd be buried in boxes in the attic, mixed with a decade's worth of other paperwork. "Graves is coming here," Joe continued. "Probably within the hour. He's bringing Sheriff Reynolds. I just wanted to warn you." "Grace, I'll back you up however I can. But if Graves has documentation—" "Get off my property," Grace said coldly. Joe's face fell. "Grace, I'm trying to help. By warning me that some rich bastard is going to steal my horse? Thanks for the heads up, Joe. Now get out." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then settled his hat back on his head. "I'm sorry. If you need anything." "We won't." They watched Joe's truck disappear down the drive. Martha put a hand on Grace's shoulder. "He meant well, honey." "I know." Grace turned back to Lightning, who was watching her with those dark, knowing eyes. "But he's wrong. This horse is ours, and I'll be damned if I let Harlan Graves take him." Doc Baker arrived 20 minutes later, his white veterinary truck rattling up the drive like an old friend. He was a lean man in his 60s, with silver hair and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent a lifetime dealing with Montana weather. He'd delivered Lightning as a foal, back when the Sunrise Ranch was still prosperous. "Grace called and said you'd found a horse in trouble," he said, grabbing his medical bag. Then he saw Lightning in the stall, and his weathered face went pale. "Sweet Jesus. That's not." "It's Lightning," Grace confirmed. "Doc, I need you to document everything. His condition, his scars, everything. We're going to need evidence." Baker's professional demeanor snapped into place. He entered the stall slowly, speaking in low tones as he began his examination. Grace, Mike, and Martha stood outside, watching as the vet's hands moved over the horse with practiced efficiency. The exam took nearly 45 minutes. When Baker finally emerged, his expression was grim. He stripped off his latex gloves and pulled out a small recorder, checking that it was running. "For the record," he began, "this is Dr. Samuel Baker, DVM, conducting an examination of a black quarter horse gelding at Sunrise Ranch on September 14th. The horse appears to be approximately 15 years old and shows signs of severe neglect and abuse. He paused, organizing his thoughts. Physical findings include malnutrition, body condition score of 2 out of 9, with prominent hip bones and visible ribs. Hooves are severely overgrown and cracked, indicating months without proper farrier care. Multiple healed scars consistent with whip marks across the shoulders and hindquarters. Evidence of rope burns around the pasterns, suggesting he was hobbled or restrained improperly. Grace felt sick. Martha had turned away, her hand pressed to her mouth. Baker continued. Additionally, I found scarring around the mouth consistent with rough handling or improper bit use. There's an old fracture in the left foreleg that healed improperly, causing a slight limp. Based on the pattern and age of these injuries, I would estimate this horse has been subjected to systematic abuse for a period of several years. He clicked off the recorder. Grace, whoever had this horse damn near destroyed him. Another few weeks, and he might not have made it. Can you save him? She asked. With proper care, yes. He's tougher than he looks. But it's going to take time and money, neither of which you have much of. Before Grace could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching made them all turn. 2 trucks were coming up the drive, Sheriff Reynolds's marked Tahoe and a massive silver Ram 3500 that could only belong to one person. Stay calm, Mike whispered. Don't give them any excuse. Harlan Graves climbed out of his truck like a king surveying conquered territory. He was 60 but looked younger, with steel gray hair perfectly styled and a physique maintained by expensive gym memberships. His jeans were pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his white Stetson probably cost more than Grace's truck. Behind him, 2 men in Crescent Moon Ranchwork shirts, essentially private security, took up positions near the trucks. Sheriff Tom Reynolds was a different story. He was 50, portly, with a drooping mustache and tired eyes. He'd known the Ramsey family for 30 years, had attended Carl Ramsey's funeral, and Grace could see the discomfort in his posture as he approached. Grace, he greeted with a nod. Martha. Mike. Sheriff. Grace replied evenly. Graves didn't wait for pleasantries. Where's my horse? Your horse. Grace kept her voice level despite the anger bubbling inside her. This is Lightning. He was born on this ranch. My father raised him. And then sold him, Graves said smoothly, to a breeding operation that I later acquired. The horse has been registered to Crescent Moon for the past 8 years. 3 weeks ago, he was stolen from my property. And now, conveniently, he shows up at an auction where you just happened to buy him. I bought him legally at a public auction, Grace shot back. Stolen property doesn't become legal just because it passes through an auction house, Graves replied, echoing Joe Miller's earlier warning. He turned to the sheriff. Tom, we've been over this. I have the registration papers, the theft report, everything you need. I want my property back. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Grace, do you have any documentation proving ownership? She doesn't need it, Doc Baker interjected, stepping forward. That horse has been systematically abused. Look at him. Those injuries didn't happen from being stolen. They happened over years of mistreatment. Graves' expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. I'm sorry to hear the horse was in poor condition at auction. That's not surprising, given that he was stolen. But his condition doesn't change the legal ownership. If he was stolen from your ranch, Grace said, why would the thieves take a valuable stallion and then sell him at a kill auction for $100? That doesn't make sense. Thieves are rarely smart, Graves replied. Or perhaps they didn't know his value. Regardless, I want my horse back. Now. No. The word came out firm and clear. Grace planted her feet. Not until you prove he's yours. I have proof, Graves said, pulling a folder from his truck. He handed it to the sheriff. Registration papers showing Crescent Moon as owner of record. Vet records showing vaccinations and treatments performed at my ranch. And the police report documenting the theft. Reynolds flipped through the papers, his frown deepening. Grace, these look legitimate. Then they're forged, Grace said flatly. Or you got them for a different horse. That is Lightning, and I can prove it. How? Graves challenged. Do you have registration papers? Vet records? Any documentation at all from the past 10 years? Grace hesitated, and Graves smiled. A thin, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. I thought not, he said. Sheriff, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but my patience has limits. That horse represents a significant investment. I want him returned to Crescent Moon immediately. Reynolds looked at Grace, apology written across his face. Grace, I'm sorry, but without documentation. Wait. The voice came from the barn. They all turned to see a young man emerging from the shadows, lean and weather-beaten, wearing dusty jeans and a torn denim jacket. Grace didn't recognize him, but Graves clearly did. His face went rigid with anger. Tommy, Graves said, the single word loaded with threat. You're trespassing. I'm a witness, the young man, Tommy replied. He looked nervous but determined as he approached Grace. Miss Ramsey? I worked at Crescent Moon for 3 years. I know that horse. Mr. Graves called him Midnight, but the other hands and I, we called him Ghost because of how he moved. He was the fastest horse on the ranch. This man was fired for theft, Graves interrupted. His testimony is worthless. I was fired for letting that horse go, Tommy corrected. I opened the gate and let him run because I couldn't stand watching what was being done to him anymore. He turned to the sheriff. Mr. Graves used that horse for breeding, but when the horse stopped performing, he got angry. I saw him whip Ghost until he bled. Saw him order the hands to tie him up without water as punishment. That horse was a champion, and Mr. Graves broke him for profit. The silence that followed was deafening. That's slander, Graves said, his voice low and dangerous. You're making accusations you can't prove. I can prove the abuse, Doc Baker said, holding up his recorder. I've documented every injury on that horse. Want to explain how a stolen horse ends up with years' worth of systematic abuse marks? Graves' jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. Animals get injured on ranches. It happens. As for this young man's accusations, they're the bitter ravings of a disgruntled employee. Sheriff, I've provided you with legal documentation of ownership. Are you going to enforce the law or not? Reynolds looked torn. He glanced from the papers in his hand to Grace's determined face to the barn where Lightning stood. Grace, I don't want to do this, but 24 hours, Grace said quickly. Give me 24 hours to find documentation. If I can't prove he's ours, you can take him. Absolutely not, Graves said. I want my property now. Sheriff, Martha spoke up for the first time, her voice quiet but firm. Carl Ramsey saved your life 20 years ago. He pulled you out of your burning truck after that accident on Highway 89. You told him at his funeral that you'd never forget what he did for you. Reynolds flinched as if struck. He stared at Martha for a long moment, then looked back at Graves. 24 hours. That seems reasonable. It seems like you're not doing your job, Graves snapped. It seems like I'm exercising discretion in a complicated situation, Reynolds replied, his voice hardening slightly. You've got documentation, and that carries weight. But Miss Ramsey has raised legitimate questions. Give her a day to find her proof. If she can't, I'll enforce your claim. Graves looked like he wanted to argue further, but he'd been around long enough to know when to retreat. Fine, 24 hours. But if that horse isn't at Crescent Moon by this time tomorrow, I'll have every lawyer in Montana on this. He climbed back into his truck, his security detail following. They departed in a spray of gravel, leaving silence in their wake. Reynolds approached Grace, his expression apologetic. I meant what I said. I owe your family. But Grace, you need to find those papers. Graves is connected, and he's vindictive. If you can't prove ownership, I'll find them, Grace said, though she had no idea where to start. After the sheriff left, Tommy shifted nervously. Miss Ramsey? I don't have anywhere to go. Graves blackballed me with every ranch in 3 counties. I was sleeping in my truck when I heard about the auction. I figured if someone bought Ghost, I could at least tell them the truth. Grace studied him. He couldn't be more than 25, with honest eyes and work-roughened hands. You have experience with horses? Yes, ma'am. Grew up on a ranch in Wyoming before my folks lost it. We can't pay much. Actually, we can't pay anything right now. But we've got a spare room in the bunkhouse, and you won't go hungry. In exchange, you help us get Lightning healthy again, and you testify if this goes to court. Tommy's face lit up. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. As Mike showed Tommy to the bunkhouse, Grace turned to Lightning's stall. The horse was watching her, and she could swear there was understanding in those dark eyes. Where did Dad keep the old papers? She asked her mother. Martha was already heading toward the house. Attic. There are boxes and boxes of them. Your father never threw anything away. The attic was a dusty maze of cardboard boxes and old furniture, illuminated by a single bare bulb. Grace and Mike started sorting through records while Martha brought up coffee and sandwiches. Hours passed. They found tax documents, feed receipts, veterinary bills from 20 years ago, but nothing specifically about Lightning's sale. This is hopeless, Mike said around midnight, rubbing his eyes. Even if we find proof Dad owned him, that doesn't prove ownership now. Whoever Dad sold him to could have legally sold him to Graves. Unless there was a restriction on the sale, Grace muttered, opening another box. This one was filled with her father's personal papers, letters, photographs, mementos. She started to close it, then paused. At the bottom of the box was a leather-bound journal, her father's neat handwriting filling the pages. Grace opened it randomly, and her father's voice seemed to echo from the past. June 12th. Had to make the hardest decision of my life today. The medical bills are piling up, and we need to make payroll. Greg Morrison from High Country Breeders offered $12,000 for Lightning. It's more than fair. The Colt's bloodlines are impeccable. But the look in Grace's eyes when I told her nearly broke my heart. I negotiated one condition. Morrison can never sell Lightning to a commercial operation. The horse deserves better than that. He signed an agreement. At least I can give Grace that much. Grace's hands trembled as she read the passage. Mom, Mike, I found something. They gathered around as she read the entry aloud. Martha's eyes widened. Your father never mentioned that. I knew he was torn up about selling Lightning, but I didn't know he'd gotten that agreement. If there was a legal agreement, Mike said slowly, and Morrison violated it by selling to Graves, then Graves' ownership might not be legal, Grace finished. We need to find that agreement. They tore through boxes with renewed energy. Dawn was breaking through the attic window when Grace's fingers closed on a manila envelope marked Lightning. Keep safe. Inside was a carbon copy of a sales agreement between Carl Ramsey and Gregory Morrison. The price, $12,000. The horse, Lightning, AQHA registration number stamped clearly. And there, in black and white, was the clause Carl had insisted on. Buyer agrees that subject horse shall not be sold, transferred, or conveyed to any commercial breeding operation, racing syndicate, or corporate ranching entity. This restriction runs with the horse for the duration of its natural life. Violation of this clause allows original seller or heirs to repurchase horse for original sale price. Both Carl and Morrison had signed it. It was notarized. It was legal. Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she clutched the document. Her father had protected Lightning even when it cost him. He'd thought of everything. We need a lawyer, Mike said. Someone who knows property law. Martha was already on her phone. Gabe Turner owes me a favor. He's in Billings, but he handles livestock cases. Let me see if I can get him here. As the sun rose fully over the Sunrise Ranch, Grace went to the barn. Lightning was standing in his stall, looking stronger already after just one night of proper care. She entered the stall and wrapped her arms around his neck. Dad protected you, she whispered. And now I'm going to finish what he started. The horse nickered softly, and for a moment, Grace felt her father's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Gabe Turner arrived at Sunrise Ranch just after 10 in the morning, driving a dusty Subaru Outback that had seen better days. He was 45, with thinning hair and the slight paunch of a man who spent more time at a desk than on a horse. But his eyes were sharp, and Martha had vouched for his integrity. Grace met him at the porch, the sales agreement protected in a plastic sleeve. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Martha said it was urgent, Gabe replied, accepting the coffee she offered, and that it involved Harlan Graves. That alone was enough to get me interested. The man's been running roughshod over property law in this county for years. They sat at the kitchen table while Gabe reviewed the document. He read it once quickly, then again more slowly, his eyebrows rising. Finally, he set it down and removed his reading glasses. This is solid, he said. The restriction clause is clearly written and properly executed. If you can prove that Graves acquired Lightning through Morrison, and if Morrison violated this clause, then Graves' ownership is void. You have the legal right to repurchase the horse for $12,000. Which we don't have, Mike pointed out glumly. First things first, Gabe said. We need to establish the chain of ownership. Can you prove this horse is the same Lightning mentioned in the agreement? The AQHA tattoo matches the registration number, Grace said. Doc Baker can testify to that. Plus the marking behind his ear, it's distinctive. Good. Next, we need to find out how Graves got the horse. He claims ownership, which means he either bought Lightning or was given him. Either way, if Morrison was in that chain, the restriction clause was violated. How do we prove that? Martha asked. Gabe smiled grimly. We make Graves produce his documentation. In detail. Every sale, every transfer. The sheriff said Graves has registration papers showing Crescent Moon as owner. Those papers would have to show how he acquired the horse. If Morrison's name appears anywhere in that chain, we've got him. The phone rang, interrupting them. Grace answered to find Sheriff Reynolds on the line, his voice apologetic. Grace, I'm calling to let you know Graves has hired Clarkson Associates out of Helena. They're preparing a replevin action to seize the horse. I'm sorry, but unless you can show me ironclad proof of ownership by 5 o'clock today, I'll have to enforce the order. We're working on it, Sheriff, Grace said, her stomach nodding. After she hung up, Gabe's expression was thoughtful. Clarkson Associates. That's a big firm for a livestock dispute. Graves is bringing in the heavy guns. So what do? Mike asked. We file our own action, Gabe said. A declaratory judgment asking the court to determine rightful ownership. I'll also file for a temporary restraining order preventing Graves from taking the horse until the matter is resolved. But I need more ammunition. Grace, has Lightning done anything unusual since you brought him home? Any strange behavior? Grace thought for a moment. He's been pawing at the same spot in his stall. I figured he was just unsettled. Show me, Gabe said. They walked to the barn, where Lightning stood quietly munching hay. True to Grace's word, there were fresh scrape marks on the wooden floor in one corner of the stall. Tommy, who'd been cleaning tack, noticed their interest. He's been doing that since last night, Tommy said. Real persistent about it, too. Kept me awake. Lightning looked up as they approached, then deliberately walked to the corner and pawed at the floor 3 times, his hoof striking the same spot with each blow. That's odd, Doc Baker commented. He'd returned to check on his patient and had joined them. Horses paw when they're anxious or looking for food, but this seems purposeful. Grace entered the stall slowly. Lightning moved aside, as if giving her access to the corner. She knelt down and examined the floorboards. They were old pine, worn smooth by decades of use, but something about this section looked different. The boards were slightly higher than the surrounding floor, as if. These boards are newer, she said, running her fingers along the edge. Look, the nail heads are different. Mike grabbed a crowbar from the tool wall. Dad did some repairs about 10 years ago. I remember because I had to help him. But I don't remember him working on the barn floor. After he sold Lightning, Martha said slowly, her eyes widening. About 2 weeks after. He said he needed to fix a weak spot, but he wouldn't let me come out here while he worked. Grace's heart began to race. Help me get these boards up. It took 20 minutes of careful prying to lift the boards without damaging them. Beneath was a shallow depression in the dirt, and nestled in that depression was a metal ammunition box, the kind the military had used decades ago. It was secured with a combination lock, the numbers worn but still readable. Dad's birthday. Grace breathed, spinning the numbers. The lock clicked open. Inside the box was a treasure trove. First, stacks of $20 gold coins wrapped in oilcloth, at least 50 of them, representing a small fortune. Mike let out a low whistle. But Grace's attention was on the papers beneath the coins. The top document was Lightning's original AQHA registration certificate, showing Carl Ramsey as the breeder and owner. Beneath that was a complete breeding record, proving Lightning's lineage back to 3 bars, one of the foundation stallions of the American quarter horse breed. There were photographs of Lightning as a yearling, as a 2-year-old, winning his first race. And at the bottom was a sealed envelope with Grace's name written in her father's handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened it. The letter inside was dated 6 months before his death. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found Lightning again. I always knew you would. That horse was meant for you, the way some things in life just are. When I sold him to Morrison, it nearly killed me. Not just because of the money troubles, though those were real enough, but because I knew what he meant to you. I made Morrison sign that clause because I hoped, someday, you'd have the chance to get Lightning back if the opportunity arose. But I also knew Morrison was a good man who'd care for the horse properly. I heard, about 2 years ago, that Morrison had died and his operation was being liquidated. I tried to find Lightning, tried to buy him back, but I was too late. He'd already been sold. I didn't tell you because you had enough to worry about with my illness. But I never stopped looking. The gold coins are from your grandmother. She gave them to me when we got married, told me to save them for when the ranch really needed them. I've kept them all these years for this moment. Use them to save the ranch, honey. Use them to bring lightning home for good. And remember, home isn't just a place. It's the people and animals we love, the memories we carry, the legacy we leave behind. You are the heart of the Sunrise Ranch, Grace. You always have been. Don't let anyone take that from you. All my love, Dad. Grace's vision blurred with tears. Martha was crying openly, and even Mike had to wipe his eyes. Gabe Turner cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly moved, but trying to maintain professional composure. This is exactly what we need, he said quietly. Original registration papers, breeding records, documentation of your family's ownership. Combined with the sales agreement and the restriction clause, this proves Lightning belongs to you, legally and morally. But Graves still has his documents, Mike said. He'll fight this. Let him fight, Grace said, her voice steady despite her tears. We're not backing down. Tommy, who'd been standing quietly in the background, spoke up. Miss Ramsey, there's something else you should know. When I worked at Crescent Moon, I saw Mr. Graves' file room. He keeps records of every horse, every transaction. If you could get access to those files, you'd have proof of how he got Lightning. That would require a court order, Gabe said, which we might be able to get if we can convince a judge there's evidence of fraud. Or, Mike said slowly, we could just ask him, publicly, where he can't refuse without looking guilty. They all turned to look at him. Mike shrugged. There's a county commission meeting tomorrow night. Graves always attends because he's trying to get approval for expanding Crescent Moon. What if Grace stood up during public comment and asked him to produce his acquisition records for Lightning? In front of the whole town. Gabe's eyes lit up. That's actually brilliant. He'd either have to produce the records or look like he's hiding something. Either way, we'd gain information. And if he produces records showing he bought Lightning from Morrison, Grace said, we've got him for violating the restriction clause. Exactly, Gabe confirmed. Let me file the paperwork this afternoon. TRO to prevent seizure of the horse, and a civil complaint for declaratory judgment. Then tomorrow night, we put Graves on the spot. After Gabe left to prepare the legal documents, Grace returned to Lightning's stall. The horse had been watching the humans with what seemed like patient interest, as if he understood the stakes. She stroked his neck, feeling the warmth beneath his slowly recovering coat. Dad knew, she whispered to him. He knew we'd find our way back to each other. Lightning turned his head and gently licked at her hair, the same affectionate gesture he'd made when she was 14 years old. Some bonds, Grace realized, transcended time and distance. That evening, as the sun set over the Montana mountains, Grace stood on the porch with her mother. The gold coins had been deposited in the bank, providing enough money to pay down the most pressing debts and keep the ranch running through winter. The registration papers were safely in Gabe's possession. Your father would be proud, Martha said softly. I hope so, Grace replied. But Mom, what if this doesn't work? What if Graves finds a way around the restriction clause? What if? Then we fight harder, Martha interrupted. That's what Ramseys do. Your father taught you that. And Lightning taught you that too, if you think about it. That horse was broken, starved, abused, and he still had the strength to come home. Don't underestimate what you can accomplish when you refuse to give up. In the barn, Lightning nickered softly, as if in agreement. Grace smiled despite her anxiety. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, she allowed herself to hope. The Cottonwood County Commission met in the basement of the courthouse, a cramped room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. By 6:30, every seat was filled. Word had spread about the confrontation between Grace Ramsey and Harlan Graves, and rural Montana loved nothing more than a good public spectacle. Grace sat in the front row, flanked by Mike and her mother. Gabe Turner was beside her, a thick folder of documents on his lap. Behind them, she could feel the presence of neighbors, some supportive, some just curious. Joe Miller was there too, she noticed, sitting near the back with his hat in his hands. Harlan Graves arrived exactly at 7, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits. He took a seat across the aisle, his posture radiating confidence. When his eyes met Grace's, he smiled, a predatory expression that made her skin crawl. The commission dealt with routine business first, a zoning variance, a road repair budget, complaints about a barking dog. Grace barely heard any of it. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, Commission Chair Margaret Walsh called for public comments. We'll hear from Grace Ramsey first. Grace stood, her legs feeling unsteady. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, but now the words seemed to flee. She gripped the podium and took a breath. My name is Grace Ramsey, she began. My family has ranched in this county for 3 generations. 4 days ago, I bought a horse at the Bozeman livestock auction. That horse is Lightning, a registered American quarter horse that was born and raised on our ranch. My father sold him 10 years ago to Gregory Morrison with a legal restriction preventing resale to commercial operations. She paused, letting that sink in. Mr. Graves claims ownership of this horse, which he calls Midnight. He says the horse was stolen from his ranch, but he refuses to explain how he acquired the horse in the first place. I'm here tonight to formally request that Mr. Graves produce documentation showing his chain of ownership, including who he bought the horse from and when. A murmur ran through the crowd. Graves' lawyer stood immediately. This is not the proper venue for a property dispute. Miss Ramsey should pursue her claims through the courts. We have, Gabe interjected, standing. This afternoon, we filed a complaint for declaratory judgment and a temporary restraining order preventing seizure of the horse. But we're also entitled to ask questions in a public forum, especially when the other party has been using law enforcement to intimidate my client. That's slander, the lawyer snapped. It's fact, Grace shot back. Mr. Graves brought the sheriff to my ranch with threats. He's hired a fancy law firm to bully us. All I'm asking is for him to show, publicly, that he has legitimate ownership of this horse. If his claim is valid, he should have nothing to hide. Commission Chair Walsh looked uncomfortable. Miss Ramsey, while we appreciate your concerns, this body isn't equipped to adjudicate property disputes. I'm not asking you to adjudicate, Grace replied. I'm asking Mr. Graves to be transparent. He's asking this commission to approve a major expansion of Crescent Moon Ranch. The people of this county have a right to know if the man seeking that approval conducts his business honestly. That struck a nerve. The commission members exchanged glances. Graves' expansion application had been controversial. Environmental groups opposed it, and several smaller ranchers worried about water rights. Harlan Graves stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled anger. This is a circus, he said. Miss Ramsey is trying to salvage a failing ranch by stealing my property. I have documentation, which I provided to Sheriff Reynolds. I'm not required to produce it for public entertainment. Then produce it for the court, Gabe said. We've requested full disclosure of your acquisition records in our complaint. You'll have to provide them in discovery anyway. Why not just show everyone now and put this matter to rest? The crowd was getting restless, murmurs of agreement and disagreement mixing. Graves' jaw tightened. Fine, he said abruptly. You want transparency? Let's be transparent. He snapped his fingers at one of his lawyers, who reluctantly pulled out a thin folder. I acquired the horse in question 3 years ago from a livestock dealer named Marcus Webb. Webb purchased various animals from the Morrison estate after Gregory Morrison died. I have a bill of sale, properly executed. He handed the document to Chair Walsh, who examined it briefly before passing it to Gabe. Grace leaned over to look. It was indeed a bill of sale, dated 3 years earlier, showing Harlan Graves purchasing one black gelding, approximately 12 years old, from Marcus Webb for $2,500. Webb is a legitimate dealer, Graves continued. He bought livestock lots from the Morrison liquidation and resold them. I have no control over what Morrison did or didn't do. If he violated some agreement with the Ramseys, that's between them and his estate. It doesn't affect my legal ownership. Gabe studied the document, his expression thoughtful. This bill of sale doesn't mention the horse's registration number or any identifying marks. How do you know this is the same horse? Webb's records show he purchased Morrison's quarter horse breeding stock, Graves replied. There was only one black gelding in that lot. It's the same horse. Can you prove that? Grace demanded. Can you show us Webb's records? I don't have Webb's records, Graves said. The man retired to Arizona. But my ownership is valid regardless. I bought the horse in good faith from a legitimate dealer. Even if Morrison violated the Ramseys' agreement, that doesn't affect my rights as a bona fide purchaser. It was a good legal argument, Grace realized with sinking dread. If Graves could show he bought the horse without knowing about the restriction, the law might protect him. Gabe's expression suggested he was thinking the same thing. There's one problem with your story, a new voice said. Everyone turned to see Tommy standing at the back of the room. He looked nervous but determined as he walked forward. I worked at Crescent Moon for 3 years, Tommy said. I know that horse. Mr. Graves didn't call him Midnight because he bought him 3 years ago. He called him Midnight because he knew the horse's original name was Lightning, and he thought it was clever to rename him the opposite. He used to brag about it. Said he'd stolen a champion right out from under the Morrison family's nose. You were fired for theft, Graves said coldly. Your testimony is worthless. I was fired for setting that horse free, Tommy corrected. Because I couldn't stand watching what you did to him. You knew exactly what that horse was worth, Mr. Graves. You knew his bloodlines. That's why you paid $2,500 when kill sales were going for $400. You knew you were getting a steal. Speculation and lies, Graves' lawyer said. Your Honor, Madam Chair, this young man's accusations are unsubstantiated. But the damage was done. The crowd was murmuring louder now, and Graves could see skepticism on several commissioners' faces. Graves had positioned himself as a legitimate businessman, but Tommy's testimony painted a different picture. Gabe seized the moment. Mr. Graves, you said you acquired the horse through Marcus Webb, but Webb's bill of sale doesn't include a registration number. How did you register the horse with the AQHA as your property? Graves hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The registration was transferred through standard AQHA procedures, which would require either the original registration certificate or a properly executed transfer document from the previous owner, Gabe pressed. Did Webb provide you with Lightning's original registration papers? The transaction was 3 years ago, Graves said. I don't recall every detail. That's convenient, Mike muttered, loud enough to be heard. Chair Walsh banged her gavel. Order. This is getting out of hand. Miss Ramsey, Mr. Graves, I suggest you both take this matter to court where it belongs. This commission is not going to resolve your dispute tonight. Agreed, Gabe said. But I think the record should show that Mr. Graves has failed to provide clear documentation of his ownership chain. That will be relevant when we get to discovery. As the meeting adjourned, Graves pushed past Grace toward the exit, his lawyers trailing behind. But at the door, he paused and turned back. You're making a mistake, he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. I own half this county. I have resources you can't imagine. Drop this now, and I'll forget it ever happened. Keep fighting, and I'll bury you. I'll foreclose on your ranch, blacklist you with every bank in Montana. Make sure you never work in agriculture again. Your family's legacy will be dust. Grace met his eyes without flinching. My family's legacy is standing up to bullies. And that horse you tortured? He's proof that some things can't be broken, no matter how hard you try. So no, Mr. Graves. I won't drop this. See you in court. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across Graves' face. Then his mask of confidence slipped back into place, and he was gone. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd gathered around Grace. Joe Miller was among them. That took guts, he said. I know I wasn't. I know I could have handled things better before. But if you need help, with the ranch, with legal fees, anything, I'm here. Grace studied him. Joe's offer sounded genuine, and she knew she couldn't afford to turn away allies. Thank you, she said. We might take you up on that. As they drove home under a star-filled Montana sky, Martha turned to Grace. Your father used to say that the hardest fights are the ones worth fighting. I think you proved that tonight. We haven't won yet, Grace cautioned. No, her mother agreed. But we showed Graves he's in for a real fight. That's something. At the ranch, Lightning was standing at his stall door, as if he'd been waiting for them. Grace went to him immediately, pressing her forehead against his neck. We stood up for you today, she whispered. Just like you stood up for yourself when you found your way home. We're in this together now. The horse nickered softly, and in that sound, Grace heard something like agreement, or maybe gratitude. Either way, it was enough to carry her through whatever came next. The legal battle that followed was brutal and exhausting. Gabe Turner filed motion after motion, each one met with fierce opposition from Graves' team of high-priced attorneys. The temporary restraining order held, preventing Graves from seizing Lightning, but the discovery process revealed just how deep Graves' deception ran. Marcus Webb, tracked down in Arizona, provided a deposition confirming that he'd sold several horses to Graves from the Morrison estate liquidation, but his records were incomplete. He couldn't definitively say whether the black gelding he sold was the same horse Morrison had bought from Carl Ramsey. However, he did confirm that Graves had specifically asked about any quarter horses with racing bloodlines, and had seemed unusually interested when Webb mentioned Morrison's breeding stock. More damning was the testimony from Dr. Sarah Chun, a veterinarian who'd worked briefly at Crescent Moon Ranch. She reported that Graves had instructed staff to use harsh training methods on a horse he called Midnight, including food deprivation and physical punishment. When she'd objected, citing animal welfare concerns, Graves had dismissed her. He told me the horse was stubborn and needed to be broken, Dr. Chin said in her deposition. He said he'd paid good money for champion bloodlines, and he was going to get his money's worth whether the horse cooperated or not. But Graves' lawyers countered with their own evidence: registration papers showing Crescent Moon as the owner of record, invoices for feed and veterinary care, even photographs of the horse at Graves' ranch. They argued that Grace's claim was based on sentiment and decade-old paperwork, not current legal reality. The case was set for a hearing before Judge Martin Hendricks, a no-nonsense jurist who'd been on the bench for 20 years. The hearing would determine whether Lightning would stay at Sunrise Ranch pending a full trial or be returned to Graves. The night before the hearing, Grace couldn't sleep. She'd gone over her testimony with Gabe a dozen times, reviewed every document until she could recite them from memory. But doubt gnawed at her. What if the judge sided with Graves? What if the legal technicalities trumped the moral truth? She went to the barn around midnight, finding Lightning awake and alert. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd begun to recover. His ribs no longer showed so prominently, and his coat had developed a faint sheen. Doc Baker said with continued care, he'd make a full recovery. Tomorrow decides everything, Grace told him, running her hand along his neck. I don't know what I'll do if we lose you again. Lightning turned his head, his dark eyes reflecting the barn lights. Then he did something extraordinary. He began to paw at the ground, not frantically, but in a deliberate rhythm. 3 paws with his right hoof, pause. 3 paws with his left hoof, pause. Grace watched, mesmerized. It was the same pattern he'd used to show her the hidden documents. Was he trying to communicate something? What is it, boy? She whispered. Lightning moved to the far corner of his stall, the opposite side from where they'd found her father's cache. He pawed again, more insistently. Grace grabbed a flashlight and knelt down. The floorboards here were original, warped with age. She ran her hands over them, searching for something. And then she felt it, a small gap between 2 boards, wide enough to slip her fingers through. Using a hoof pick, she pried at the gap. The board lifted easily, as if it had been designed to do so. Beneath was a small hollow in the dirt, and resting in that hollow was a faded photograph in a plastic bag. Grace carefully extracted the photo and held it under the flashlight. It showed her father as a much younger man, standing beside Lightning when the horse was in his prime. But it wasn't alone. There was another photograph beneath it, this one showing Lightning at a racetrack, a blue ribbon around his neck. And written on the back in her father's handwriting, Lightning, first place, Montana Quarter Horse Futurity, 2015. Best time, 20.1 seconds. Remember, Grace's breath caught. The Montana Quarter Horse Futurity was a prestigious race, and Lightning's time would have been recorded in official documents. If she could get those records, it would provide independent verification of Lightning's identity beyond just the registration papers. She pulled out her phone and called Gabe, not caring about the late hour. Grace? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Lightning won a futurity race in 2015. If we can get the official race records, they'll show his registration number, his time, probably even a photograph. That's independent proof that this horse is Lightning, not just some random black gelding. There was a pause, then Gabe's voice came back excited. The Quarter Horse Association keeps race records. And futurity races, those are big deals. The records would include detailed information. Grace, this could be the evidence we need. Can you get them by tomorrow? I'll try. The AQHA office doesn't open until 8, but I'll call in every favor I have. Grace hung up and looked at Lightning, who was watching her with what she could only describe as satisfaction. You knew, she said wonderingly. Somehow, you knew we needed more proof. The horse nickered and returned to munching his hay, as if his work was done. The courtroom was packed when they arrived the next morning. Graves sat at the defendant's table with his legal team, looking confident. Grace sat with Gabe, her palms sweating despite the cool air conditioning. Judge Hendricks took the bench promptly at 9. He was a tall man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. This is a preliminary hearing to determine temporary ownership of one black gelding. AQHA registration number, ? Pending full trial. Miss Ramsey, you have the burden of proof. Proceed. Gabe stood. Your Honor, we'll prove that the horse currently in my client's possession is Lightning, a quarter horse originally bred and owned by Carl Ramsey. We'll further prove that when Mr. Ramsey sold Lightning to Gregory Morrison 10 years ago, there was a restriction clause preventing resale to commercial operations. That clause was violated when Morrison's estate sold the horse to Marcus Webb, who then sold it to Harlan Graves. Under the terms of the original agreement, the Ramsey family has the right to repurchase Lightning. That's a lot to prove, Judge Hendricks observed. What evidence do you have? Over the next hour, Gabe methodically presented their case. He called Doc Baker to testify about the horse's identifying marks and the AQHA tattoo. He introduced the original sales agreement with its restriction clause. He presented Carl Ramsey's registration papers and breeding records. Graves' lead attorney, a shark-like man named Philip Clarkson, cross-examined aggressively. Dr. Baker, isn't it true that identification based on markings and tattoos can be unreliable? Horses can have similar markings. Tattoos can be altered. In theory, yes, Baker admitted. But the combination of the ear marking and the tattoo, along with the horse's age and general description, makes it highly unlikely this is a different animal. Highly unlikely isn't the same as certain, is it? No, but in veterinary medicine. Thank you, doctor. That's all. When it was Graves' turn, Clarkson presented a parade of documents showing Crescent Moon's ownership. He called a ranch hand who testified that he'd cared for Midnight for 3 years. He produced invoices and vet bills. Your Honor, Clarkson argued, my client purchased this horse in good faith from a legitimate dealer. Even if there was some restriction in a previous sale, which we dispute, Mr. Graves had no knowledge of it. Under Montana law, a bona fide purchaser for value takes property free of encumbrances he had no notice of. Judge Hendricks looked at Gabe. That's a valid argument, counsel. How do you respond? We dispute that Mr. Graves was a bona fide purchaser, Gabe said. Evidence suggests he knew exactly what he was buying. But more importantly, Your Honor, we have additional evidence that definitively identifies this horse as Lightning. He pulled out a folder that had been delivered by courier just 30 minutes before the hearing. These are official race records from the American Quarter Horse Association for the 2015 Montana Quarter Horse Futurity. They show that a black gelding named Lightning, registration number matching our documents, won first place with a time of 20.1 seconds. The records include a photograph of the winning horse. He handed copies to the judge and to Clarkson, who looked suddenly uncertain. Your Honor, Gabe continued, if the court will allow, I'd like to call an expert witness via video conference. Dr. Robert Morrison, Gregory Morrison's son, is currently in Wyoming and can testify about his father's purchase of Lightning and the subsequent sale of the estate's livestock. Judge Hendricks considered. I'll allow it. Bailiff, set up the video link. 10 minutes later, Dr. Robert Morrison's face appeared on a screen at the front of the courtroom. He was a man in his 50s with his father's kind eyes. Dr. Morrison, Gabe began. Can you tell the court about your father's purchase of a horse named Lightning from Carl Ramsey? Yes. My father bought Lightning in 2015 for $12,000. He was very excited about the horse's bloodlines and race record. Lightning had just won the Futurity, and my father saw breeding potential. Did your father honor any restrictions on the sale? Absolutely. Mr. Ramsey had insisted that Lightning never be sold to a commercial operation. My father agreed because he planned to use Lightning for small-scale breeding at our family ranch. He respected Mr. Ramsey's wishes. What happened to Lightning after your father died? Robert's expression grew sad. My father passed in 2020. I live in Wyoming and couldn't maintain the Montana ranch. We had to liquidate the livestock. I specifically instructed our estate manager to ensure all animals went to good homes, and that any with special conditions attached had those conditions honored. But Lightning was sold to Marcus Webb, a livestock dealer. Yes, and I was told Webb had buyers lined up for the breeding stock. I assumed. Robert paused. I assumed the restriction would be honored. I should have followed up. That's my failure. When I learned recently what had happened to Lightning, I was horrified. Clarkson stood. Objection. This witness's assumptions are irrelevant. The fact remains that my client bought the horse legally from Webb. But Mr. Graves knew about the restriction, Gabe countered. Dr. Morrison, did anyone from Crescent Moon Ranch ever contact you about Lightning? Yes. About 4 years ago, a man who identified himself as Harlan Graves' ranch manager called me. He said they were researching bloodlines and asked if we'd sold any quarter horses with racing records. I mentioned Lightning's sale to Webb. The manager asked specific questions about Lightning's training and temperament. I didn't think much of it at the time, but in retrospect, it seems he was gathering information. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Hendricks banged his gavel. Order. Clarkson was on his feet. Objection. This is hearsay and speculation. Even if such a call occurred, it doesn't prove my client had knowledge of any restriction. It proves he knew the horse's history. Gabe shot back. He knew Lightning was a champion. He sought out information about the horse specifically. That's not a bona fide purchaser acting in ignorance, Your Honor. That's someone deliberately circumventing a restriction. Judge Hendricks removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I've heard enough. This matter is complex and requires careful consideration. However, for purposes of the preliminary injunction, I find that Miss Ramsey has raised sufficient questions about both the horse's identity and Mr. Graves' knowledge of the restriction clause. The temporary restraining order will remain in effect. Lightning will remain in Miss Ramsey's custody pending a full trial. Graves' face went red. Your Honor, this is... Careful, Mr. Graves, the judge warned. I understand you're frustrated, but I've made my ruling. We'll schedule a trial date for full adjudication. Until then, Miss Ramsey maintains possession. Court is adjourned. As the gavel fell, Grace felt her knees go weak with relief. Mike caught her arm, steadying her. We did it, he whispered. We actually did it. For now, Gabe cautioned. But this is a good sign. Very good. Outside the courthouse, Graves was surrounded by reporters. Grace could hear his voice carrying across the plaza. This is a miscarriage of justice. I will appeal. I will pursue every legal avenue available. But Grace didn't care about Graves' bluster. All she cared about was getting home to Lightning. When they arrived at Sunrise Ranch, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Lightning was in the paddock, moving freely for the first time in who knew how long. When he saw Grace, he trotted over to the fence, his gait still slightly uneven but growing stronger each day. Hey, boy, Grace said softly, reaching through the rails to stroke his nose. You're staying home. For real this time. As if he understood, Lightning tossed his head and nickered, then wheeled and galloped across the paddock, his black coat gleaming in the dying light. It wasn't the powerful, ground-eating stride of a champion racehorse, but it was beautiful nonetheless, the stride of a survivor, a fighter, a horse coming home. Martha came to stand beside Grace, slipping an arm around her daughter's waist. Your father would be so proud. I hope so, Grace replied. But we're not done yet. The trial will come when it comes, Martha interrupted. For tonight, just enjoy this. Enjoy knowing that horse is where he belongs. Grace nodded, watching Lightning run. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. 3 months later, the trial concluded with a settlement. Faced with mounting evidence of his knowledge of the restriction clause and testimony from former employees about his treatment of Lightning, Harlan Graves agreed to relinquish all claims to the horse. In exchange, the Ramseys agreed not to pursue charges of animal cruelty, though the threat of such charges would follow Graves for years, damaging his reputation in the ranching community. The gold coins Carl Ramsey had hidden provided enough capital to stabilize Sunrise Ranch's finances. Grace negotiated a partnership with Joe Miller, merging their operations to create a breeding program focused on preserving classic quarter horse bloodlines. It was an equal partnership, with both families contributing land and expertise. Lightning, now fully recovered, became the foundation sire of their breeding program. His first crop of foals, born the following spring, showed the same speed and intelligence that had made him a champion. Grace never raced them. That wasn't the point. The point was preserving something valuable, something worth fighting for. On a clear morning in June, Grace saddled Lightning for the first time since his return. Doc Baker had cleared him for light riding, and Grace had been waiting for this moment with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Would he remember? Would the years of abuse have broken the trust they'd once shared? She needn't have worried. The moment she settled into the saddle, Lightning's ears pricked forward eagerly. When she applied gentle pressure with her legs, he moved forward in a smooth, collected walk that spoke of perfect understanding between horse and rider. They rode out across the ranch, the morning sun warming Grace's back. The grass was green after spring rains, and wildflowers dotted the meadows in splashes of color. The mountains rose in the distance, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to this moment of simple perfection. As they topped a rise, Grace saw Joe riding toward them on his own horse, a red-roan mare named Sunset. He'd become a regular presence at Sunrise Ranch, and while Grace wasn't ready to call what was developing between them a relationship exactly, she wasn't not ready either. Tom would tell. "Beautiful morning for a ride," Joe called as he drew near. "Every morning's beautiful when you're riding a horse like this," Grace replied, patting Lightning's neck. Joe smiled. "True enough. Your mom wanted me to tell you the farrier's here. He's looking at that new colt, the one out of Lightning and my mare Starlight." "How's he look?" "Like a champion," Joe said simply. "Just like his sire." They rode back together, taking the long way around to enjoy the morning. As Sunrise Ranch came into view, Grace felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in years. The barn needed a new roof, and the north fence line still needed repair. There would always be work, always challenges. But there would also be moments like this, moments of peace and possibility. Lightning seemed to sense her mood. He tossed his head playfully, the white blaze on his nose catching the sunlight. Grace laughed and let him canter, feeling the powerful muscles bunch and release beneath her, feeling the wind in her hair. They were both survivors, both fighters, both proof that some things, family, loyalty, home, were worth any struggle to preserve. As they approached the barn, Grace saw her mother standing on the porch, waving. Mike was there too, having decided to stay and help run the ranch after all. Tommy had become a permanent employee, his quiet way with horses making him invaluable. Even Gabe Turner was there, having stopped by to finalize some paperwork and stayed for breakfast, as he often did these days. This was what her father had fought to protect. Not just land or buildings, but the life itself, the community, the connections, the sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. Grace dismounted and led Lightning to his stall, removing his tack and brushing him down with long, rhythmic strokes. The horse leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed in contentment. "Thank you," she whispered to him. "Thank you for coming home. Thank you for reminding me what's worth fighting for." Lightning nickered softly, and in that sound, Grace heard everything she needed to know. Some journeys end exactly where they're supposed to. Not where we planned, but where we belong. Outside, the Montana sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and illuminating the land in golden light. Another day at Sunrise Ranch had begun, full of promise and possibility. And that, Grace thought as she stepped out of the barn into the light, was more than enough.